Hi, welcome everyone to the American Cornerstone Institute's latest Cornerstone conversation on border security. I'm Evelyn Lim, the Director of Policy and Research at the American Cornerstone Institute. Our Cornerstone conversations are made possible by generous donors. For more information how you could support American Cornerstone, please visit our website at americancornerstone.org. Today, we are talking about the important issue of border security, specifically the current migrant surge on the southern border. It is something the Biden administration has refused to call a crisis. However, we know the numbers of people we are seeing illegally crossing our border far exceed any other period of time in the last 2 decades. Of course, we have Dr. Ben Carson with us today. Dr. Carson is a world-renowned neurosurgeon, author, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, 17th Secretary of HUD, and the founder and chairman of American Cornerstone Institute. We also have Chad Wolf, the former acting secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the third largest cabinet department in the U.S. federal government, and the world's largest law enforcement organization. He has served at DHS both under President George W. Bush and Donald J. Trump. He is the founder and president of Wolf Global Advisors, a strategic advisory and public policy firm, and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Carson, I'll turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Evelyn. And a special thanks to Chad Wolf. We couldn't ask for a more expert advice in dealing with this very important topic. Something that has plagued many administrations for a long period of time. You know, I got into a lot of very heated discussions as secretary up on Capitol Hill about why we don't just go ahead and take a comprehensive look at our immigration policies, some of which make sense and some which make no sense at all. But I think there are many in the political world who find this to be just too juicy an issue to resolve. So why not just kick it around and let it be a political toy? And unfortunately, that has landed us in a very difficult situation. The previous administration, the Trump administration, did an amazing job of getting the border under control with wall construction, with the agreements with Mexico to finally put in an adequate number of troops, particularly at their southern border, which greatly limited the influx. The stay in Mexico policy, rather than the catch and release policy, which has virtually been reenacted now. And, you know, basically the new administration came in without a real plan. The only plan was to undo everything that the previous administration had done without regard to what the impact of it would be. And the impact of it, of course, has been a crisis at the border. They refuse to call it that because they put so much emphasis on names and labels. But the fact of the matter is, our eyes tell us that it is a crisis that is going on. You know, that's why FEMA has gotten involved and a number of other federal agencies have gotten involved. And that's why cameras were kept away for the longest period of time, trying to hide the transgressions that were going on. But, you know, the American people are not stupid, as indicated by recent polling that demonstrates that most people feel that the administration is doing a horrible job at the border. But, you know, I hope that people, the American people, can get some justice. You know, we need, obviously, if we're going to have a sovereign country, to have borders. They need to be protected borders. And we need to do it in a way that makes sense and that is compassionate, fully recognizing that we are a country of immigrants, but we're a country of legal immigrants. And we have the most generous legal immigration program in the world. We legally admit more than 1 million people a year. Nobody else does that. So it's not like we're trying to keep people out. It's just that we want to have some order in the way that things are done. So that's a little overview, but again, we're very happy to have Chad Wolf with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. And you alluded to this a little bit about what the Biden administration did essentially on day one, which was roll back a lot of Trump policies. Mr. Wolf, can you tell us a little bit about that, as you know, and kind of lead us to how did we get here?
Thanks, Evelyn, and Dr. Carson. Appreciate the invitation to be on this afternoon. I think it's important to remember as we look at the crisis that's unfolding down there today, and then we're thinking about solutions, right? Because that's what everyone wants to solve this issue, I think, across the board. It's important to figure out how we got to where we're at. And so during the Trump administration, we had a crisis not quite as severe as this one in 2019. And we had to come up with a variety of different policies and programs that would address the surge that we saw in 2019, made up of largely the same populations, family units and minors. And so we did that, and throughout the course of 19 and 20, we got numbers down to historic lows by both making sure that we care for those individuals and groups that come into our custody, which we should do, but also making sure that we impose a consequence to the illegal behavior at the end of the day. And I think that's really important, and that's a big part of what the current administration is not doing, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So what we saw on January the 20th, as Evelyn alluded to, was a number of these initiatives were rolled back really either on day one in some cases, or certainly in week one. And what that did essentially is open up the doors and opened up the gates to have a variety of folks coming in. So you not only had a change in policy, but you had messaging from the Biden administration. You had the Secretary of Homeland Security saying you can come, but don't come now, right? And so that's a too nuanced a message for migrants that are looking for any reason, any signal to come to the U.S. And so when they hear an official in authority say you can come, well, guess what? They're going to come, and obviously they're coming in droves. So in March alone, 172,000 illegal apprehensions. That's the highest it's been in about 19 years. Children, we talk a lot about children under the Trump administration. And I think at the height in 2019, we had about 2,600 children in custody. At the height of this crisis back in March, again, the numbers are still increasing. The Biden administration had over 5,000 in Border Patrol facilities, over 20,000 in HHS facilities. So when we talk about crisis, what's going on today, unfortunately, has dwarfed what we saw in 2019 and really in 2014, which was the next closest crisis prior to that. So I think it's really been unfortunately, it's been a crisis. It's a self-inflicted crisis is what I describe it as, right? And that's unfortunate because as President Biden came into office, we had an economic crisis, we still do. And we had a public health crisis, which we still do. The last thing we needed was a humanitarian and security crisis on that border. So unfortunately, they took a number of steps, I believe, in my view, for political reasons. And that's put the frontline men and women, law enforcement officers at DHS and Border Patrol in a very, very difficult position. And a lot of them are talking out. And a lot of them have a lot of things to say about what they're having to go through today.
What's particularly interesting as an aside here, there's been a great narrative lately about the United States being a systemically racist country and all the horrible things that we do to minorities. If that were the case, why would all these people be trying to come here? I think that pretty much gives lie to that whole argument about systemic racism.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I will say that, the vast majority of the workforce of Border Patrol are actually Hispanic at the end of the day. And the amount of care and attention that they provide these individuals, minors, families, single adults that come into their custody, it's really remarkable and astonishing. That's not the mission that they're trained for at the Border Patrol Academy, unfortunately, right? They have a national security mission, but they get put in this position, unfortunately, and they have to adapt to it. And so they are extremely gracious with their time and efforts, the humanity that they provide. A lot of these folks that come across the border is just remarkable. And you don't see that unless you visit the border, right? You don't see that unless you talk with the men and women of the Border Patrol and you're down there and you spend time with them. And unfortunately, again, seen from this administration, the vice president who was presumably, somewhat in charge of the border crisis, or at least trying to solve it, has not taken, trip one down to the border to talk with her men and women of the Border Patrol. Just hasn't done it. And so it's quite, like I said, astonishing at the end of the day.
Perhaps one of the reasons that they don't want to go to the border is it's heartbreaking to see some of those children, particularly the very small children, 3, 4, 5 years old. The look of bewilderment. Where are my parents? Where are the people who care about me? And to put a small child in that kind of situation traumatizes them, which can have lifelong impact. And I think it's important that we keep that on the front burner and help people to recognize that this is a terrible thing that's happening. Many of the older children are being abused and not just raped along the way, but actually sold into slavery. And I'm actually coming to DC tonight to watch a premiere of a movie about the sex trafficking that's going on, and that has increased dramatically because of what we're doing or not doing on the border. So, you hear people talking about who's compassionate and who's not compassionate. It's really compassionate to enact policies that prevent this kind of abuse of children, not policies that facilitate it.
Well, you're exactly right. And, I think we've all heard, the current administration and officials talking about how inhumane the Trump administration was with their immigration policy. And the first question I asked them is which ones exactly, because you need to explain that accusation. Because these are the policies that we implemented was to make sure that we rooted out the fraud and abuse that we saw in the immigration system. But first and foremost, it was make sure that folks that were truly being persecuted, that had an asylum claim, that they got that protection as close to home as possible. That's an international norm across the globe, is that you want to make sure that you provide folks protection as close to their home country as possible, because eventually you want them to return to their home country to, again, make sure that it prospers economically, politically, socially. Particularly younger people, they're the future of their countries. And so you want to make sure that they return there. And it's just the opposite, as you described, Dr. Carson. This administration's policy is to encourage that illegal behavior. They're encouraging people to take a very, very dangerous journey. We tried to stop people from taking a dangerous journey. They are encouraging people taking it, and they're doing it with all the facts at hand. The facts being that 90% of these folks do not qualify for asylum. So they are encouraging them to take a dangerous journey, spend their life savings, become abused, and knowing that they will be removed from the US at some point in the future, only to repeat the process again. And that's the inhumane policy, I believe, that is occurring. But unfortunately, they've taken it a step further, right?
Right.
Because they've also said, okay, let's address the fact that when they come here and they don't qualify for asylum and they stay here in the US, let's make sure that ICE can't remove them. So the Biden administration has given policy guidance and direction to ICE not to remove big poor populations of folks that, again, have no legal right to remain here in the US. So they're really attacking it on all sides. And I think, it's important for people to understand really what's going on here.
And those policies, with reference to ICE, obviously facilitate criminal activity as they infiltrate the country, go into all of these different communities and endanger people who live there. It's very hard to understand the motivation of people who would create a situation where people with criminal records don't have to abide by the law, can do whatever they want, cannot be managed by ICE, cannot be deported. And you just say to your citizens, tough luck, too bad. And then you have a media who covers you and says how wonderful you are. It's almost surreal what's going on.
Well, that's a great description. And just to put a finer point on that, the guidance that they sent out for ICE, if you can imagine, you either have to be a terrorist, you have to be convicted felon to get removed, which means if CBP or ICE, for that matter, comes across 17 or let's say 21-year-old individual who has tattoos, is an MS-13 gang member, has been identified, has 7 charges for felony assaults or burglaries or make it up. The Biden administration has told ICE that they cannot remove that individual. They have to release that individual into U.S. communities today. And again, they have no legal right to remain here in the U.S. So it's a fundamentally different perspective on how you enforce, or I would say lack of enforcement of immigration law.
And also, if I was a terrorist from Yemen or any place, boy, would this be a great opportunity just to come in and mix in with the population there, and recognizing the fact that the Border Patrol agents are going to be overwhelmed with the work that they have to do, which leaves you wide open. I had a chance to visit the border in Arizona, and there were places where you could just walk through with no obstruction whatsoever onto people's lands. Obviously, that situation improved dramatically under the previous administration, but there's still gaps, there's still areas where the Border Patrol played an essential role in making sure that they weren't breached. And now they're so busy taking care of these unaccompanied children, dealing with the others who are coming through, that they once again leave those areas unattended and free for anybody to come through.
We talk a lot of humanitarian crisis, but there's a big security component here, from pulling agents off of that national security mission or finding individuals. We don't have a lot of really bad people, terrorists, come through that southwest border, but we do have some that try to make that journey. And we've seen in recent days that they've been able to pick up what we call known or suspected terrorists, KSTs, as well as other individuals on watch list. And that's concerning because these are just the individuals that we are able to apprehend.
That's
right?
Okay. Right.
So
and these people are well trained. They're well trained in terms of how to breach the border. So there's a very good chance that we're not catching most of them.
Well, we're not. We use a term called gotaways. In the month of March alone, probably about anywhere from 20 to 25,000 gotaways in the month of March. So that's a population we don't know anything about. And the concern there is you don't need an overwhelmingly large number of known or suspected terrorists, right? Because but some critics say, well, it's only a handful. It's really not as bad as you're trying to make it out to be. And my question to them is, how many do you need? That's why DHS does the job that they do. We often say, we have to get it right every single day of the week. And the bad guys only have to get it right once. But if you're not giving the men and women of Border Patrol the tools, the resources, and the ability to do their job correctly every day, it's shameful, quite frankly.
I wanted to jump in a little bit because we talk about the Border Patrol and how they are in fact overwhelmed. I think, they haven't really been able to say so, but you hear it kind of reading between the lines in terms of how they are messaging. And if you could talk a little bit about just the numbers of people that are coming through, because I think, one of the things that people don't understand is that these people, we mentioned most of them are not terrorists, but it is in fact taking away from their security mission. Many of them will cross the border illegally and just hand themselves over to Border Patrol.
Right.
And that in of itself takes away from their important security mission, but also, how they process these migrants.
Couple of things, and I certainly let Dr. Carson jump in here. I think there's a couple of things to remember is that any individual crossing that border illegally across the southwest border, every single one of them is paying a cartel member of some value, anywhere between 4,000 and 7,000 per head to do that. So it's obviously is a bigger concern because it's basically a cycle. You're fueling the cartels who are obviously using that money to, again, smuggle and traffic more human beings across that, but also drugs, contraband, and others. So you really want to stop this flow for a variety of different reasons. And again, very, very concerning that the current administration, as far as I can tell, is approaching this issue from a capacity standpoint. Is how do we solve what they believe they have as a capacity issue, which is they have these large numbers of individuals, but they don't have enough housing. They don't have enough Border Patrol agents to process them. So they're trying to figure out how to process more and more of these. And I would argue that that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Yes, you have to care for them, but if you want to stop this crisis, you have to address the security along that border, and you have to stop encouraging more and more of it, basically saying the more that come, the more that we'll take care of. And you have to address that at the end of the day.
Yeah, the percentages of unaccompanied children, of family unit individuals, of single adults have all increased rather substantially, month over month, and tripled to quadruple year over year. So this is not just an incidental rise.
Right.
And one of the things that is very concerning to me, particularly from the medical standpoint, is we are not imposing sufficient screening in terms of COVID-19 and individuals who are coming across, nor are we taking the precautions once they're in custody. And in many cases, they are sent out, catch and release, COVID and all, to go wherever they want and to spread whatever they want. It's very difficult to make any sense out of a policy like that. At the same time, imposing, tremendous restrictions on some of our own people. People are people. Disease is disease. It doesn't discriminate between people, and they all need to be treated the same in terms of preventive measures. And yet that's not happening here. And I think that's something that really needs to be pointed out to the American people.
That's precisely right. And I will say, I would take it a step further. If you are trying to do any type of trade or certain types of activities across that border in a legal fashion. So you use that, you use the 25 or 30 or so ports of entry every single day to come back and forth to US communities, to Mexican communities. The US government still has restrictions in place that say you can't do that because of COVID, because of the spread of COVID. So that we have what we call non-essential travel restrictions in place there, that if you're on one side of the border and you want to go shopping on the other side, you can't do that. But you can do that if you cross the border illegally, and they will let you in. Or if you're outside the country and you want to come back into the US and you're on an airplane, right? You have to get tested. And if you're positive, you got to quarantine. There's a number of things you have to do, but you don't have to do any of that if you come across illegally. You don't have to do any of it. And they allow you to come in, and they'll say that their goal is to test everyone. And then, you'll ask them, well, are you testing everyone? And they'll answer, our goal is to test everyone, which means to say they're not testing everyone.
Right.
And so it gets back to your health, the public health issues that you outlined, which a lot of those communities along the border are really feeling firsthand these days.
Can you talk a little bit about the Title 42 authority? Because the administration will say that they are, in fact, using that authority on people crossing the border illegally. How is it different under this administration and how it was used in the Trump administration?
So Title 42 is a public health authority provided by CDC, which is actually an order to DHS, and it was ordered back in March of 2020 that says your Border Patrol facilities, CBP, are not set up to accommodate large groups of individuals in a COVID-like environment, where the spread of that can happen in close proximity. So it required DHS at the time to turn individuals back around to Mexico or repatriate them back home to their home countries, because we wanted to make sure that our facilities weren't overrun, that our communities along the border weren't overrun, but most importantly, that our frontline men and women were safe and secure from COVID as well. I mean, can you imagine if 30% of that workforce went down, then who's doing that job along the border? There's no backup. We're not 6 deep in that area. So we have a frontline workforce. So we were doing that with single adults, we were doing that with family units, and we were doing that with minors. And I think one of the most, I'll say, disgusting things that I've heard from this administration thus far, and unfortunately, it came from President Biden on a national TV, where he said that Border Patrol was simply turning kids around, putting them back into the desert of Mexico, or watching them starve on the banks of the Rio Grande. And I just tell you, that's offensive on a number of fronts. Again, these men and women of Border Patrol and law enforcement care for everyone that comes into their custody. And so to make just a blanket statement like that is just, it hurts. And I will say that it is the administration and even DHS leadership, they have lost all confidence from the men and women of Border Patrol. The Border Patrol, the law enforcement officers have zero confidence in their leadership and their ability to lead at the end of the day. So what is the Biden administration is doing? They've decided that, evidently they've decided that COVID affects single adults and families different than it affects minors, because they've decided not to use Title 42 on minors. So if you're a minor, and let's break that down for a minute. 75% of minors are 16 and 17 years of age. So it's not the 8-year-old, or it's not the 5-year-old or the 4-year-old in most cases. And so they've said, if you're of that age, we're not going to return you. We're actually going to invite you into our facilities, which again, COVID-related concerns are still there. And you're still exposing a lot of our law enforcement officers to those folks. So they've somehow decided that COVID can affect different populations differently, which I think is an absurd argument. Either there is a public health emergency for everyone, or there's a public health emergency for no one. And that's how we treated it under the Trump administration. And again, what they're doing here is selectively choosing certain populations because they think it's more politically expedient to do so, unfortunately.
The previous administration, the Trump administration, withheld some of the funds from the Northern Triangle countries, but it was for a purpose. It was to get them to cooperate with some very effective policies, and it accomplished that purpose. And people say that is mean, that's cruel. What's really cruel, not only to the people in those regions, but to our people who have to pay the bill, is just without any kinds of appropriate criteria, just sending money that sometimes is wasted, is used in various ways that are not beneficial in terms of the goals that we're trying to accomplish. And I don't really have any problem whatsoever with helping, underdeveloped countries. That was done quite effectively for some countries in Africa that were having a lot of agricultural problems, and USDA was able to enact some policies that allowed some of our people to go over there and to help them with some of the farming issues, which created a lot more produce, a lot more jobs. Those kinds of things actually make sense, and that would make sense also. But we have to get something for it, because this is costing the American people, a lot of money. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with a business model, which was more or less what was going on in the previous administration, where you say tit for tat, you do this, we'll do this. And that helps to create the kinds of behaviors that resulted in a dramatic, I can't emphasize enough, dramatic decrease in the number of illegal people coming across the border.
We often talked about a three-legged stool if you wanted to address a crisis that we're seeing today, right? One is that foreign assistance, so helping those countries have more stability and more economic prosperity, I think is important. And I think that's just one part of the solution there. The second one being border security, making sure that you're enforcing the border and the law. And the third one being making sure that folks, if they get through the border, as we've been talking about, that there's a way to remove those individuals once they go through due process. We call that interior enforcement. And unfortunately, the only thing that the Biden administration is talking about right now is the root causes of migration, which, again, I don't disagree that that needs to be addressed, but that is a multi-year process. That is not going to solve what we see occurring on the border today. And what I've heard from the administration say over and over again is that the previous administration stopped this, and that's simply not true. That's not the facts. as you indicated, Doctor. You know, we made sure that we were getting a good return on our investment.
Right.
So President Trump, being the businessman he is and not a career politician, said, what are we getting for this? And when we weren't getting what we needed from those countries as far as assistance and cooperation, well, he decided to put a pause on that. And guess what? They signed over a dozen different agreements with DHS, from border security to asylum cooperations, biometric agreements, customs agreements. We got over a dozen different agreements signed, and then we turned that foreign assistance back on. And they worked with us throughout the remainder of the administration. So I would say what we did works, and it's not just throwing money. And if you look at the immigration bill that the Biden administration, put forward in the first month of the administration here, it's a very large number for that foreign assistance. And almost 50, I think it was like $4 billion, and 50% of it had no strings attached, zero. They could spend it as they wanted, when they wanted, and how they wanted, which is just, it's not the way you do business.
Right.
Not if you want to see any effective results being accomplished.
And
Well-
the other fake news was that the Trump administration would take these kids and just turn them back out into the desert. And that, of course, is just total fake news. Those people were put on airplanes, other modes of transportation, and delivered back safely. And, there's so much lying that goes on in order to try to get people to agree. And that's one of the things that American Cornerstone is doing, is getting the real information out to people so that they can make decisions based on real facts and not on fake news.
Very important. Very important. Glad you guys are doing that.
Obviously, border security is part of immigration reform. As you mentioned, the Biden administration has come out with their proposal. And so I just wanted to end on this question, Mr. Wolf. What does immigration reform look like to you?
I think President Biden talked a little bit about this last night, and it was a throwaway line. If you weren't paying attention, you would probably miss it. I was paying pretty close attention to it. So he said, if you want to solve, the border security issues that's going on, then pass that bill. And the bill is a fairly large bill. It's about 500 to 600 pages. And he talked about there's technology in there for the border. It's 2 pages out of a 500 to 600 page bill where they actually talk about border security measures. So my recommendation to lawmakers and to others is, it doesn't matter what you do in the Northern Triangle as far as foreign aid and getting to the root causes. It doesn't matter what you do here in the US. As long as that border remains open, that is the most significant pull factor that we could put out there. And it's going to continue to encourage folks to come across. So any type of immigration reform first has to start with strong, effective border security and interior enforcement. Until we let DHS and ICE actually enforce immigration law. The most frustrating thing I had as acting secretary is members of Congress, mostly Democrats, would come to me every day and say, please don't do this or that, whatever that was at the end of the day. And it was always immigration enforcement. And I had to remind them time and time again, you pass the law. As a congresswoman or a congressman, you pass the law. If you don't like it, change the law, but don't ask DHS to ignore it, because we're not going to do that. But unfortunately, that's exactly what DHS is doing under this administration. They are ignoring portions of the law that they find objectionable instead of going through the legislative process to work with Congress to come up with a compromise and a solution to change the law. They won't do that. It's too hard. It's too difficult for them. Either that or they don't have a consensus to do that. And so we see, men and women of DHS putting in very difficult circumstances. So before we start talking about amnesty, before we start talking about DACA and things like that, you've got to solve the issue that's going on the border. And I've always said, you can't talk about DACA or amnesty for a DACA population until you start closing these loopholes, because the last thing I think any of us want to do is in 5 years from now, start talking about amnesty for the millions of folks who entered the country in 2021. I don't think that's the right public policy choice at the end of the day, but unfortunately, that's the route we're going down at the moment.
And Dr. Carson, you, in your Newsweek op-ed a few weeks ago, you said President Biden must learn from history's lessons, secure the border, know who's in our country, require employers to verify worker authorization of all employees, enforce the laws as written, humanely, of course, but effectively and efficiently as well. Americans deserve a fair, secure, humane, and transparent immigration system. It is only with true enforcement that we will get the immigration system we deserve. So I'm taking it that you agree with Chad, and I'll have you comment on that. But one of the things, as you know, at American Cornerstone Institute is we talk about civility in our discourse. And my question to you is, how do we bring back civility in immigration reform? People are being characterized as cruel or inhumane or immoral, where they refuse to identify that there's even a crisis at hand. How do we get beyond that so we can actually start talking about solutions again?
There has to be an adult in the room. And, there frequently is not. And people just get into their respective corners and hurl insults, which only drives the other side further into their corner. So someone has to really just start dealing with common sense and talking about real solutions without trying to demonize the other party. I'm glad to hear Chad say that he had conversations with members of Congress who wanted him to ignore the law, because I had that many times when I went up for hearings on Capitol Hills, and they would be after me to do things, and I would say, it's your law. If you don't like it, change the law. Are you asking me to break the law? And of course, they could never answer that question, but of course, that's exactly what they were doing. That makes absolutely no sense, and that's why we have legislative bodies. But overall, you need to recognize that any sovereign country has to have borders, and it has to have enforceable borders. And historically, that has been the case all around the world. And even in Washington, D.C., after the events in January, what did they do? Put up walls, barbed wire, troops. So obviously they believe that that's effective, or they wouldn't have done that. So if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. And again, going right back to common sense, which does not seem to be an overabundant supply in Washington, D.C., but it's one of the reasons that we have to continue to push these things out to the general public, to educate them about what the real facts are. I appreciate so much Secretary Wolf coming and adding that perspective. And we, the American people, are not adversarial with people from the Northern Triangle, from Mexico, or from any other part of the world. They are welcome to come to our country through legal processes that are in place, that are amongst the most generous in the world. In the meantime, we have an obligation. One of the reasons that we have government is to enforce the laws, enforce the rules, not to make exceptions to the rules, not just to enforce the ones that you want to enforce for political purposes. And I think when we can get back to that, I think we can be on the path to great success as a nation. If we don't get back to that, it will lead to certain destruction.
Well, on that note, we will continue this conversation because there is so much to talk about in terms of immigration reform and border security. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Carson and Mr. Wolf, for your service during the administration during a very tumultuous time. We would love to have you back, Chad, to talk more about this, as well as other areas of the DHS mission, which are very wide-ranging. For those of you listening, if you want to see this Cornerstone conversation and others, please visit us at americancornerstone.org. Thank you.